Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Live from the Heartland. I'm Michael James. I'm here in Chicago. And this would be number 156 during the time of the pandemic when we started to do it via Zoom, not live anymore. And it's also number 2 during Pride Month. This one is for the week of June 10th, 2023. We're recording it on the 7th. And today's guests are going to be Michael Harrington from Network 49 right here in the neighborhood. And Jeff Biggers, the writer, is going to talk to us about Sardinia and his new book. And our own music producer, Lynn Orman, will come on and share some information about some of the music we've had in the last month and what's coming up. So stay tuned for almost a solid hour of good information. I think you'll have a good time. To start it off, I'd like to just say there are a lot of bad things going on in the world. It depends how you want to look at it, but we got a war in Ukraine still going on. Apparently, a dam has been blown up. It's not sure who did it. It's endangering a lot of folks. Apparently, the Ukrainian offensive has begun. Here in Chicago, we have a new mayor. We have events coming up. Let's just say that despite whatever may be going on that is negative, there's a lot of good going on the earth in Chicago and in our neighborhood. And it is summer, and summer is a good time to work on ourselves, to work with others, to be active in many, many ways, and to kind of get ourselves ready for the colder months that will come and not too far off. So have a good time, get out, do things, a little bit less TV, speaking to myself. You can do your reading and your writing outdoors. It's beautiful here today, and make the most of it. Okay, with that said, here in Chicago, let me share that there's been a whole lot of energy spent from people trying to prevent the iron recycling plant that the judge just gave a go-ahead, and Brandon Johnson has said that he will oppose it. So the environmental justice advocates are putting their trust in our new mayor, that he is appealing the decision by an administrative judge overturning the city's denial of General Iron's permit for the controversial Southeast Side metal shredding facility. That's from the Daily Line. And I don't know where the metal recycling and shredding stuff is supposed to take place, but it's probably not a good idea having it take place where people live nearby. Also, in a challenging front is weather. 17 states are reported to issue serious air quality alerts as smoke from wildfires in Canada drifts south over the U.S. And there's evidence of it here in Chicago. Reports from my daughters in New York City are that it's really bad. It's worse than Delhi, is the quote I have. I'm not sure that's true. But people in New York are having to stay inside. So climate change is real. People got to pay attention to it. And we'll see if we can figure out a way to prevent all these fires. Okay. On the negative front, a white woman has been arrested after being accused of fatally shooting her black neighbor right through the front door. Apparently, this happened in Florida. The issue is stand your ground, which is we remember Trayvon Martin and how he was killed by a guy who said he was standing his ground. It's a terrible law. It's being challenged. But apparently, there was something going on with kids and an iPad and toys and an argument, and one woman shot another through the door. So we're sad about that. Also, 2 people died in Richmond, Virginia, after there was shooting after a high school graduation. Let's move over to the labor front. I look at this thing called Payday. And it's got a lot of good information. Also, it has a lot of fundraising for the guy who puts it out to travel to this place or that. And one place that he did go to was Brazil. And of course, we've been talking about Brazil off and on. And let me just say that Bolsonaro is to face trial on June 22nd. Also, 340,000 Teamsters have voted to go on strike. The Rochester newspaper workers have had a walkout, and my own union, SAG-AFTRA, Screen Actors Guild, has voted, had a strike vote, and I voted to go forward with a strike if necessary. The Directors Guild has signed an agreement. The Writers Guild are still out. I think the Directors Guild probably weren't as principled as they could be in how they went about that, but we'll find out more and share more. Up the union. Little interesting news. We've always had on this show people who are critical of charter schools. I'm sure there's some good ones. I have a granddaughter who goes to one in New York that's pretty good. But basically, it's a privatization of the school system, and it's money taken away from public schools. In Oklahoma, a local school board approved the nation's first religious charter school. And that was after a warning from the state's attorney general that the decision was unconstitutional. So stay tuned for that. On the sports front, we're always a few days late with what's going on. Let me just say that the White Sox won their opening game on Tuesday night against the Yankees. The Cubs lost to the Angels. And a few days back, the Chicago Red Stars beat the Angel City team, which is out of L.A. Last week, we had the filmmaker John DeGraff had a wonderful film on Stuart Udall, environment and stuff, and it's a real interesting interview. And we also had the musician Barry Goldberg, who is in town Friday the 9th, the 10th, 11th, etc., with Born in Chicago, the blues movie that we had the director and producers on. And a little bit later, Lynn Orman's going to come on and talk about music going on around the city. On a real sad note, a good friend of mine named Michael Lukenbach, longtime Rogers Park resident, he passed away this week. I love talking to Mike about Southern Illinois when his dad ran movie theaters, when he talked about Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee down there in Cairo and Carbondale in the old days. Mike was a wonderful guy, and I'm very sorry. Our heart goes out to his daughter and to his brother, and I don't know if he has any other relatives. On another sad note, some of the people who remember the Heartland Cafe's bartender, Charles Cannon, he and his wife, Laura Edelman Cannon, just lost their daughter, Belle, in an accident, and that hits close to home. Our hearts go out to Laura, to Charles, and to their son, Russell. Okay, I think that'll be it for the opening banner, and we're going to take a little pause, and we'll be right back with our first guest, Michael Harrington, who is the co-chair of Network 49, progressive political organization that I am a part of. I'm on the steering committee, and we do good work here in the 49th Ward. We'll be right back with more Live from the Heartland. And it really brings me a lot of pleasure to bring on a guy I've known for quite a few years now. He's a pal. We've had our differences, and we've certainly worked together certainly for the last 10 years or so. The one and only Michael Harrington. Good morning to you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning.
Afternoon.
To you as well.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Michael is the co-chair of Network 49, which is a political organization here in the 49th Ward that does a lot of good work. And one of the things that we've reported on regularly, and Michael's been on the show about, is the consent decree with the Chicago Police Department. So we're going to hear an update on what's going on with that and with the meetings before a judge, et cetera, et cetera. But first, Mike, tell us what a consent decree is and what is the specific consent decree that we're dealing with here today.
Okay, absolutely. It's the U.S. Federal Court consent decree, which is a document that required the city of Chicago and the Chicago Police Department to come to the table to address longstanding issues of racist policing in Chicago, policies and practices by the Chicago Police Department for decades. Our organization, Network 49, joined with a dozen other community groups about 7 years ago to petition the federal court to impose a consent decree on Chicago's police department. 2 years later, 5 years ago, the federal court, the U.S. Justice Department, did bring suit against the city of Chicago and its police department. and forced an agreement where the city of Chicago, Chicago Police Department, and also joined by the Illinois Attorney General, they all agreed to work on improvements in the Chicago Police Department. It's a court order. Network 49 is one of a dozen community groups that are empowered and authorized to also provide input and oversight information to the federal court about what's happening with the Chicago Police Department's compliance. There's several hundred directives that the police department is required to work on to improvements, and everything from recruitment to supervision to training to evaluation to discipline to officer wellness. The police department in Chicago actually has only accomplished less than 5% of what was laid out in the consent decree. It's been 5 years now, and they got an extension for court supervision of the police department for another 4 years. So Network 49 and these other groups have been paying attention to what's happening in policing. And last week, we went to federal court and testified about our assessment of police training in Chicago.
What I've got here is the CPD, Chicago Police Department consent decree hearing statement to U.S. Federal Court Judge Rebecca Palomire. And you know, as a member of Network 49 and on the steering committee, I got the alert that you had put this together and you had written this letter to the judge. How did the judge respond? First of all, what was in this letter? It was, it had a long list of many things, some of which you've mentioned, but what was her response?
Well, the judge, you know, with several people around Chicago, a couple dozen people were giving testimony. This was actual Zoom court testimony. What you got was a document of my presentation. And the judge thanked us for sharing this. She's going to be considering over the summer all of the issues that we've raised. And there's going to be another hearing in September where she responds to the issues. And the main issue that we raised was about training. And there's some context that most people need to think about when you think about Chicago policing and training. Firstly, training is considered to be wonderful. We always talk about training as a belief that police training is going to solve the problems, that it's a foundation in professional policing. But what we discovered when our use of force community working group members went to the police academy, and we spent several days sitting in classes, interviewing the police trainers on the side and talking to police officers, we found a lot of problems that basically we discovered that with the use of force training and CPD, which is very important, the training undermines its own policy and encourages the problematic culture that led to the consent decree. Officers attend training because they're required and paid. However, attention is where many fail. You know, we learned that CPD does not devote enough time to training. There are too few quality instructors and too many students per instructor. Exhausted officers fell asleep in class because they worked the night before. Officers showed strong resistance to several important issues in the training. The context is that we need to realize that Chicago already has a $2 billion budget for the police department and spent another $100 million to build a new police training facility, and more millions of dollars are thrown at the problem every year. Millions for lawyers to defend CPD against lawsuits and to compensate mostly Black and brown victims of police abuse and violence. Millions more fuel the work of several related agencies that oversee the police department: the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, the Chicago Police Board, the new Community Commission for Public Safety Accountability, the Office of Inspector General, and the federal court's own monitor, which is a so far $10 million expense. We're paying for a lot of oversight. We're paying millions for training, but the training is really poor. When we consider the failed training, we have to think about how that impacts on regular citizens in Chicago and even the police officers. The use of force training is super important we saw, for instance, officers taught on how to use their gun and when to use their gun. But the problem is there's a repeated theme in training that an officer's first priority is to go home at the end of the day because their lives are seen as worth more than community member lives. It's an us versus them mentality that actually teaches police to fear us. So in training, we saw officers jump to reach for their gun when they were uncertain about the situation. We saw officers pull their gun when they're not supposed to because of the mentality of not respecting anybody out there. All of us, black, white, brown, green, blue. It's the officers who are trained to fear the rest of us.
Mike, you talked early on about the police not really wanting to come to the table and the resistance to the training and certainly to the consent decree. What was it? Solid resistance? Is it across the board? Are there any areas that the police department were more cooperative with and willing to make changes, or is it a pretty solid resistance kind of a stance?
It's a strong resistance. We've been working with the police department, these community groups in this coalition. The police, because the consent decree required them to meet with community groups, and so they've been meeting with us, but they haven't agreed with us. So for 4 years, we've already been talking to them about policy changes, and on these training issues, we had several dozen concerns. We met with the police department brass, their research department, their policy department, all the police department officials. We met with them a month ago. We spent about an hour and a half talking about the issues raised in our report. They said, that's interesting. Oh, that looks good. Oh, thank you very much for doing this work. They're always very nice. And there's been no follow-up. We want to find out, are they going to make the changes? Are they even going to consider the issues we raised? Are they going to come back with an alternative to what we suggested? We say A, we want to hear them respond to A and B, and so on and so forth. We're not having that. And we're hoping that with the new mayor, there will be a different mindset in the police department, actually be listened to and be accountable to the residents.
What's your take on the new mayor and where he might go? And I mean, there's a lot of up in the air around who's going to be the new commander and or superintendent. And we're all hopeful. We like our new mayor. A lot of people, a lot of boots on the ground turned into great success. And what is your take about how you think he will be in appointing a new superintendent?
Superintendent Brandon Johnson, Chicago's new mayor. He's only been in office like 4 weeks. Our organization worked hard to help elect him, and we're very proud. And we carried this ward for
73%.
Right. There were many different candidates, but at the end of the day, we said he's got the credentials and has the spirit and has the proposals, the track record and the proposals that make sense for us. We're optimistic that what he's going to do is understand that all of Chicago can be served. There's enough, his theme is that there's enough money, there's enough resources to help everybody, rather than ignore the decades of disinvestment that have happened on the south and west side of Chicago, that all neighborhoods deserve policing, they deserve constitutional policing, they deserve fair policing, and responsive, non-racist policing. So I think Brandon Johnson is going to be pushing that. The new community commission is going to be selecting candidates for him in July. He'll have 3 candidates to review and decide which one is the one that's best to be Chicago's new police superintendent. Brandon Johnson's going to be giving them a charge to actually be responsive and accountable. We have a huge amount of money spent every year, millions, to repair and compensate victims of police violence. I believe that's going to be turned around quickly with the appointment of a better superintendent that's going to lay down the law, require officers to follow their own guidelines and their own policies, which unfortunately have been ignored too long. And that's why we have a U.S. federal court consent decree monitoring and overseeing the Chicago Police Department.
Michael Harrington, you mentioned that we are part of a larger group working, putting together this use of force community working group. Who else is on that besides Network 49? What other
Network 40,
groups around the city?
Network 49, Chicago, ACLU, Black Lives Matter, designs the Designs for Change organization that's focused on handicapped people. The Illinois Attorney General is participating in this. The Brighton Park Neighbors organization is participating in this. The West Side NAACP is a member of our coalition as well. So it's a broad base of interracial groups, mostly civic-oriented organizations and communities around Chicago.
Before we close out, and this is something we will stay abreast of as it goes on, what's your sense of what we do here and this consent decree and how it gets handled and consent decrees around the country? Is it a meaningful vehicle to bring about significant change?
Yeah, this is. In fact, there's a couple dozen police consent decrees in effect around the nation. And Los Angeles consent decree is a very, very progressive one. But ours is even more because it carves out a role for citizen input. We talk directly to the federal court judge, and the federal court judge then is going to make rulings on what the Chicago Police Department needs to do. It's a long, slow process. It's a legal process, and we're now 5 years into it. But it really has the potential to make great change, and we're excited about new Judge Pallmeyer, who is overseeing the case, as we are excited about our new mayor, Brandon Johnson.
We also have a new thing that we just had our first election for, which were police oversight committees. Now, that's a separate thing from the consent decree, but also something geared toward community control of police.
Right. District councils are now in effect across the city. There are the 20-some police districts. There's a district council of 3 elected residents from each police district sit on the district council, which is to take input from residents about what public safety and policing in their neighborhood looks like. Here in the Rogers Park community, ours is the 24th Police District Council. Those 3 council members meet with our local police district commander to work on improvements in public safety and address problems with policing by officers in this district. So they are Evite Jones and Veronica Areola and Marilyn Pagan Banks are our 3 representatives who are meeting with the 24th District leadership.
Well, we hope it goes well. As much as I've had run-ins with the police over the year, I've also had some wonderful experiences. I know there are good people and not so good people on the police force, but the police are part of the community, and they need to serve the community and not oppose the community.
And their neighbors and their residents in Chicago. So we really need to be working together.
Can I take this opportunity to shift a little bit? And
sure.
Let's talk a little bit about Gay Pride Month.
Pride Month.
And, I know you're an advocate for the rights of LGBT people. And you probably can give us some information about how you see it in the country at a time when the right wing is really hitting us heavy.
The right wing is going full stop on their agenda, which is spend no money, care about nobody else but themselves. As a gay father, raised my 2 kids here in Rogers Park, I'm very happy to be out. I'm happy that we have a recognized Pride Month. It gives support to the many different LGBTQ people in this city, in this nation, in this world who have been oppressed for too long. I think it's important to recognize and celebrate Pride, because there's a lot about what we do as neighbors, as relatives, as members of families to uplift, improve, and enrich our communities. I'm happy to have made contributions to my community wherever I've lived as a gay man. I've been out since many years, and my kids.
Ever since I've known you.
Both of my kids are working and educated and doing fine. The funniest, wildest thing about this Florida right wing stuff is about the anti-drag and don't say gay and don't educate people. This is ridiculous. Guns are more lethal than drag queens. Education is more productive than ignorance. I'm happy to celebrate Pride.
It's good. I celebrate it too. I am the proud father of two wonderful kids who are gay, and I'm the grandfather to two kids who, one of each of my kids has a kid, and there's a lot to do around this. I thought we were really moving forward. That we advanced the gay marriage. A lot of people were quick to go over to supporting LGBT stuff because most people in the country have a friend, a relative, a neighbor who's gay. And I thought we really had made some really serious strides, but apparently pretty much the Christian right wing and their influence, they have decided to attack transgender people big time. The whole drag thing, which you mentioned, we did have a victory, I think, in Tennessee where that drag thing was unconstitutional. Let's have some hope for the judicial system and the people in Florida and a lot of other states that can really. I talk to people from Florida and they're crazy about their governor. He's just I don't understand it.
DeSantis. Well, it's about why I'm part of Network 49 is to encourage voter education and voter participation. That really is the solution to a lot of these. The right wing people are a small minority, but they're a loud voice. The rest of us are the majority, and we need to raise our voices in action and participation.
How do people get a hold and find out about Network 49? I know we have a Facebook site.
And our website is Network 49. Network 49. It's www.network49.net, N-E-T, not O-R-G, .net. But they could also write or call me, Michael Harrington. My number is 773-971-1215 if you're interested in Network 49. Or you can email me at michaelharrington123@gmail.com. Be happy to
I hope you're inundated with calls and emails.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for welcoming me.
And thanks for coming on the show. It's always good. And I will be seeing you pretty soon. We have another steering committee meeting coming up. Okay, brother. Have a great day. Bye-bye. We're going to be right back with more Live from the Heartland. So stay tuned here on the left end of your dial. Welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of June 10th. And I'm Michael James here in Chicago. And I'm bringing on someone who's no stranger to our show. Been on a number of times. The one, the only Jeff Biggers, who's living out in Iowa, but he's going to talk about somewhere in Italy. How are you, Jeff?
Just great. Always wonderful to be back on your show, Mike. Just great to chat with you.
Well, you have a new book out, In Sardinia, An Unexpected Journey in Italy. And it's an island I don't know much about, and we're going to get into it. But I've really loved your earlier books. You talk about the Appalachian rebel activist Don West. You did a book on the Sierra Madre with the Tarahumara.
Yeah.
And you did a book on poverty in Appalachia. And last time I saw you, we talked together at a book signing you were doing on a book about the resistance. Now you have a book called In Sardinia, An Unexpected Journey in Italy. How about telling us what led you to do this? And it is in the same political vein, or it's a new you that's emerging?
That's a really good point, Mike. All of my books, I think, follow a certain thread of themes, which is I'm largely interested in regions that have been marginalized, regions that have been left out of the historical record, regions that I feel have been misrepresented often in both the historical chronicle, but also in our contemporary journalism. And I kind of stumbled into this, even though as you know well, I come from Southern Illinois. And of course, my people drifted into Chicago in the 50s and 60s, but then we went back to Southern Illinois. I've often felt I've had this need to go to other regions in the world, be it in Appalachia, be it in the borderlands of Mexico, into the Sierra Madre in India, and now in various parts of Europe, like Sardinia and Italy, to look at areas that I feel like have been left out of our historical discussions, and even worse, have been marginalized. And so I think a lot of my work is recovery work. It's historical recovery. It's trying to give the other side, the people who've been left out of this discussion, a chance to tell their story, which I often find is pretty amazing.
Well, I don't know much about Sardinia, and we're going to ask you about that, but let's just jump right off with this quote that I found. And it's from D.H. Lawrence. It's not a quote. It's, he wrote a book called Sea in Sardinia in 1921, just over 100 years ago. And he found little to love on the island other than its perceived wilderness and archaic cultures. You think it's one of the most beautiful places in Italy and in Europe, and you've opened a way for us to know more about it. What's your take on D.H. Lawrence and where he was amiss, and what about Sardinia?
Right. D.H. Lawrence, this masterful writer that we were all forced to read in high school and afterwards.
I never read him, I'll confess.
and a lot of it crossed the paths that you took as a traveler. The first time I read Lawrence, in fact, was not his famous novels that were scandalous and often banned, about sex and whatnot, but he wrote some incredible books about Mexico and Guatemala. And he actually ended up in Taos, New Mexico, where he was very close to Mabel Dodge. And in fact, his ashes have been buried there. And I've always had this struggle with D.H. Lawrence because he came from a coal mining family like I did. Of course, he was from England and he tried to escape it and he ran off to Europe and eventually around the world. But Lawrence was searching for the primitive. He was looking for kind of pre-industrial areas. And in this particular moment, 100 years ago, he was living in Sicily and he decided to run off on a little adventure. And he went to Sardinia. And he was flabbergasted in his journey. In fact, he only spent 6 days there, Mike, 6 days. And he found little that he liked because largely it dispelled this idea that Sardinia was this lost island, pre-industrial, where everybody was primitive and had these kind of ancient rituals. And so here's D.H. Lawrence going around with his thermos. It was one of the modern inventions because obviously he needed his hot tea, and yet he was searching for the primitive. And so he goes to Calgary and he says, oh, this is a God-forbidden town. He goes and gets on the bus and goes up to another town, which he writes off as horrible and dirty. And then he goes to Nuoro, which is one of the capitals in the mountain. And he finds there's nothing to see. And then, 2 days later, he's on the boat and he goes back to Sicily. In less than 3 weeks, he writes this book called Sea in Sardinia. And because he's such a masterful writer, blending, fiction and fact, and he famously took no notes, this book becomes hugely important and hugely famous because it really is the landmark book in travel writing and the book that remains on the shelf for 100 years looking at Sardinia. And he pretty much didn't see anything other than these little stereotypes and captions of his travels. And so here's the funny part. In 1921, exactly 100 years ago, he's looking for the primitive. But in 1921, Antonio Gramsci, the great political thinker who comes from Sardinia, is founding the Communist Party with another Sardinian named Togliatti in Italy. And in 1921, you have the resistance leader, a guy named Emilio Lussu, who was a World War I veteran who wrote a novel that was compared to Hemingway on the front cover of the New York Times. And he comes back and he says, hey, World War I was a war of the poor against poor, and we need to unite. And he founds the first autonomous political party in all of Italy, based there in Sardinia. And in 1921, you have Grazia Deledda, who just a few years later will win the Nobel Prize for Literature, the first Italian woman coming from Sardinia who wins this prize. And she's part of this incredible cultural revival at the Venice Biennale, where all the famous artists and sculptors are. You have Sardinians like Francesco Ciusa and so many other writers and so many other poets and so many other artists who are completely changing Italy and Europe and the world today. And so that was this strange thing I had to look at is, this important book, landmark book, that had defined Sardinia as this left behind, God-forsaken island. And in fact, the truth was, it was this vibrant, beautiful, and very important island that really had shaped Italy and the rest of the world.
Jeff Biggers, you just listed a whole lot of progressive, left of center, clearly important people. And I'm wondering, was that the kind of catalyst for more progressive stuff in all of Italy? Was Sardinia first in terms of producing people who went on to organize leftist political parties? And what's its current situation politically in relation to Italy? I'm not sure. I think Italy just elected someone far to the right.
Right.
So I'm not sure if you want to talk about what's going on in Italy, what's going on in Sardinia, how the two mix and one influences the other.
You know, that's a really good question and a very complicated question. The new prime minister of Italy, her name is Meloni, and she's just pretty much a card-carrying fascist, you know. And the sad thing is her father was from Sardinia, you know, so go figure. But
so Sardinia has left and right.
Oh, of course. And in fact, right now, the contemporary Sardinian politics are controlled by a right-wing party. And one of the things I talk about in the book is everywhere I go, so many of these foundational patriots and resistance leaders who were from Sardinia, the idea was, oh, Abilio Lusu would be turning in his grave if he knew what was happening to Sardinia today. Antonio Gramsci would be turning in his grave if he knew what was happening to Sardinia today. So there definitely is a divided, polarized Sardinia as we have in Italy and then the rest of the world. But the continuum here, Michael, that I think you're touching on is the theme of resistance. You know, so here's an island that goes back for thousands of years. In fact, the only ziggurat, and that's those kind of step pyramids that you only see in the Middle East, the only ziggurat in all of Europe is in Sardinia. And it goes back to 6,000 years, a 6,000-year-old pyramid there. That was a major sanctuary and pilgrim site for all the Mediterranean. And then by the Bronze Age, which is 4,000 years ago, Sardinia had a civilization that emerged that really was the cradle of civilization in the Mediterranean, working with Crete, working with all the way back to Cyprus and the Levant in the Middle East. And so you have Sardinia playing a major role. And then if we jump up a couple more thousand years, you have suddenly the invasion of the Carthaginians, the invasion of the ancient Romans, eventually the invasions of anyone you can imagine, from the Goths to the Vandals, eventually the Spanish, eventually the Savoyards, who become the kings of Sardinia and the kings of Italy. And then you have the contemporary Italian government. And throughout all this, there is this theme of resistance, of Sardinians who have been occupied, colonized, and attacked, and ultimately oppressed, who've had to resist against that. And for that very reason, I think they've churned out an incredible level of resistance leaders who've really affected us in contemporary times.
Jeff, give us a picture, a little travelogue or a little view of what the island's like. How many people? How big? What kind of industry, farming? I know that there's a lot of great wine there. Fill us in a little bit about, already I want to go. And what would I find?
No, it took me 30 years, Mike, to get to Sardinia. As you know, I've been connected to Italy since 1989. And my wife is from Italy, and we were based in Bologna for many years. And we go back and we've raised our children as both Italians and Americans. But it took us 30 years to finally get over to Sardinia, because there was this sense that it was over there, it was hard to get to. And I think now in the last 10 years or so, we've had these discount airlines that have completely changed the question of travel. You can get to Italy, you can get to Sardinia as easily as you can get from Bologna to Rome or Bologna to Milan or anywhere. And so
that's a switch, right? Because I think I read that a lot of people end up going to Rome and Florence, but they don't make the trip because it was a long ferry ride and flights were expensive. Now it's different. Now you got cheap flights, and it's probably tourism is on the rise.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's been Sardinia has always been characterized as this kind of fabled beaches. In fact, this week everybody is looking at Sardinia because the Little Mermaid movie came out, and Little Mermaid was filmed on the gorgeous beaches of Sardinia. And in fact, there was an uptick of 200% in terms of flights that were booked online just this past week. But let's first go back and try to decide where it is. So as we know, here's Italy coming down with the boot. and you have the Rome in the center, and then you go further down to where you have Calabria and whatnot, and then out here is Sicily. And there in the Mediterranean, north of Sicily, is the second largest island, which is Sardinia. But I prefer, Mike, to tilt the map a little bit. There's this great cartographer from Paris named Sabine Ratour, and she created these maps without borders. And she said, instead of us looking at Europe on top and Africa on the bottom, and here's Italy, and Sardinia is this peripheral island, kind of over there, away, meaning that it has no part in history. She said, why don't we tilt the map 90 degrees? And so we do that. And now we have Europe coming down on the right, and it goes ultimately into Turkey. And on the left, we have North Africa and the Maghreb that ultimately winds down, of course, to Egypt and then all around. And there in the center of this map now that we've turned is the Mediterranean. And if you look right there in the middle of the Mediterranean, you have the islands. And this, of course, in the center of the center is Sardinia. And this ultimately is a much more authentic look at the role of the Mediterranean and Sardinia, because the central story of Europe has been the Mediterranean. That was the nexus of navigation. That's where the great ideas emerged. That's where the exchange of civilizations occurred. And central to all that, as we're learning with great archaeological discoveries, is Sardinia at the center of the story of the Mediterranean in Italy and all of Europe.
So if I went to Sardinia, besides drinking some wine, what would you recommend that a guy like me do? Someone who likes politics, likes agriculture, likes old buildings, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. So you have this floating island, and 80% of it is hills or mountains. And so that's why a lot of people tend to stay on these gorgeous, coastal coves. And so here's the first thing. People, oh my God, look at these beaches. It's the Caribbean or the Mediterranean. And they don't realize it was because of a very liberal government in 2006 that took power, that passed very strict environmental protection laws that says you can't build within 3 miles or 3 kilometers of the beach. And of course, there had been a lot of concrete and poor tourist areas, poor meaning concretes and kind of mass tourism areas. And of course, there was the famous jet set area in the north called the Costa Smeralda, the Emerald Coast. But this blocked the development of what ultimately would have been a very regrettable decision. So if you go to Sardinia, of course, you're going to begin with these fabulous beaches where literally you're alone on miles and kilometers of just untouched coves and blue waters, and where you actually can see the kind of fish that you imagine. And then from there, you go in and you begin to eat and you begin to drink. And of course, Canada wine is the elixir of the blue zones. You might have heard about the blue zone phenomenon of around the world are these certain areas that have been picked because there are so many centenarians, people who live over the age of 100. And that actually comes from Sardinia. All these villages had so many people who were over the age of 100, and they realized it was related to the fact that they didn't have so much pollution, that they had a walking culture. They drank this wonderful artery scrubbing Canada wine, and they ate really good local food. And then you begin, Michael, this is the fabulous thing, is that you can't go more than 5 or 10 miles without seeing these Bronze Age towers. They're called nuragis. They can be as high as 100 feet. And they're these ancient stones stacked on each other who are still there. And we're talking about 8,000 of these structures throughout the island. It's really incomparable in the rest of Europe. And it's a reminder, once again, of the incredible role that Sardinia played in the Bronze Age. So you're going essentially from incredible nature on the beach, incredible nature in the hills, into the mountains, these beautiful gorges and mountain ranges, to these beautiful archaeological ruins. And then in the evening, you have these fabulous dinners and fabulous drinks. So it's really a mix of all culture and nature that you can imagine. And then we'll talk later about the incredible literary history.
Well, we'll get to that. Then we'll go right into that. I was going to ask you, what is your favorite single, if you have a favorite thing about Sardinia or thing to do when you're there?
That's, I don't know. It's like asking for your favorite moment in Ernie Banks's life.
Yeah, I understand.
But I would say, I've just fallen in love with so many places. It's perhaps for me as a writer, as someone come from the literary community, is the role of writing and literature. It's the role of poetry. You know, Michael, for centuries, they've had this vibrant tradition of oral poetry contests, ultimately poetry slams, where people meet in the town squares or in other parts, and poets go onto the stage and they throw out a theme and they do these improvised poems, and there's singers on the side. And the singers, of course, come from this ancient tradition called cantu o tenore, where it's these chilling polyphonic quartets. And we learned about this, of course, in the 1980s because Frank Zappa put them onto his albums, you know, these throat singers that were coming from Sardinia. And so that literary tradition to me is fabulous because you go from town to town or village to village, and you're going to find some sort of music, be it the traditional music, folk music, jazz, you know, Sardinia is exploding with jazz, or classical music. And you also always will find some literary or artistic tradition. And with your music producer, I'll send him a soundtrack we put on Spotify. Because if you like jazz, you have to remember the son of a shepherd whose name was Paulo Fresu, first heard the trumpet in the village band, then he picked up a flugelhorn, and then suddenly he hears Miles Davis and he goes to the conservatory. And within a few years, the New York Times is calling Paulo Fresu the heir to Miles Davis and Chet Baker. And in fact, just this summer, he's created a recording studio, the only jazz recording studio in the old milk cooperative where his dad had worked as a shepherd. I think that level of music is kind of amazing. And once again, I can share with you a soundtrack that we have that walks us through the history of much of Sardinia through its different music. They had a woman very similar to Joan Baez. Her name was Maria Carta, and she was incredible. She became Miss Sardinia during the Miss Italia contest. She went to Rome. She started to sing songs. They said, hey, sing your folk songs. And there she began to mine and go back and do research and sing their own songs in her own language. Sardinia, of course, has its own language apart from Italian. Maria Carta became very important as a folk singer, as a political folk singer. In the 1960s, she actually is elected to the Rome City Council as a member of the Communist Party. And she tours around the world, both as a singer, an actress, and a political activist. And unfortunately, she died quite young, but she remains, once again, one of the leading iconic figures that came from Sardinia.
Jeff, one of the things you're known for, besides your writing of history, being a playwright, a journalist, et cetera, is being a monologuist. Have you ever done any monologues at any of these events over in Sardinia?
You know, I'm just now going to be working with theater groups in Sardinia. So we went there in 2016 for a vacation. Like a lot of people, we just went to the beach. And after that, we suddenly saw this beautiful city in the Northwest, this medieval town that was hugging the coast, and the sun was setting and this promontory was falling into the sea like some sleeping giant. And we said, hey, we have to go live there. And so, in fact, we went back in 2017 for our sabbatical. And for the last 5 years, we've been going back. So this summer, I'll be working with a theater festival. One is called Musa Madre, that works with both Sardinians and expats, Sardinians who've come abroad and now want to go back. And how do we use culture and the arts and the narrative traditions to refine their roots and to, once again, blend the outside with the inside cultural ways. I also will be working with some journalism festivals and some other storytelling festivals. And I'm actually quite active with some archaeological groups who are trying to raise more attention for cultural tourism, get people to come to Sardinia to see not just the beaches, but also the great archaeological sites.
Well, I definitely want to go to Sardinia. And you, at the outset of the show, you talked about your books addressing marginalized communities. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to switch to what could be a marginalized community, which would be progressives in your state of Iowa, where you live a lot of the time. So is it okay with you if we flip to Iowa for a few minutes?
Sure.
So what's going on? My people came out of Coyne, Iowa, in the southwest corner. I always loved Iowa. There used to be some great Democrats, Tom Harkin, et cetera, out of Iowa. All of a sudden, we, in the last few years, we see Iowa as really being in a kind of a conservative camp. And you've been writing stories. I think it was the New York Times, could have been somewhere else, about windmills in Iowa. Right. What's going on out there?
Yeah, so the good news is Iowa, no thanks to our politics, has become a leader in renewable energy. Mid-American, which is one of the great utility companies here, has invested billions, and now we get 80% of our electricity from wind turbines, which is kind of
Wow.
amazing. I personally have solar panels, but the wind turbines, of course, have been important. The other part of that is that Mid-American then maintains 5 coal plants in the western part of the state, so it's not an all rosy situation. So what happened, Mike? In a nutshell, you had this state that was united in both liberal and Democrat, rural, suburban, and urban in the areas of Des Moines and these little college towns, and then a couple of factory towns like Cedar Rapids. And that slowly has changed. I think like the polarization we see in other parts of the country, suddenly you have the blue state type people, fleeing to college towns, to more urban areas politically. So in Iowa City, where I live, it's virtually 85% Democrat. And then if you go 10 minutes outside city limits, it's going to be the complete opposite, be 85% Republican. That kind of polarization has torn the state. You're seeing a massive departure of young people from Iowa, which used to feed in and actually help, mix the state. And now you're seeing young people get educated either from high school or college and then hitting the road because they don't want to be here anymore. There's not an economic future for them. The graying of agriculture, of course, is part of the crisis. We know, of course, during Reagan, we had the collapse of the family farmer. And now with corporate farms shifting, to commodities, be it beans or corn, which really are not eaten, but of course used for livestock or ethanol, has really changed the agricultural communities, which are gutted. These small towns, if you go from town to town, this is where your great photography work is really needed. It's to show how Iowa, like so many other parts of the rural Midwest, has been gutted. And therefore, the people who've remained are often the conservatives, those who are cut off, those who have tended to go with the right. And I think that's what we're seeing now is this domination of small town areas who have a very unbalanced control of power. We've taken over the legislature. Now we have this, governor who's really in the hands of the NRA and the right-wing lobbyist. And you have a liberal communities that are trying to respond some way, but it's just very difficult if we're outnumbered. And I think ultimately it's about the changing world of climate change. Iowa is going to be a critical area because it will be one of these central areas that will focus on food production. And we have to really decide whether we're going to continue with these commodities like corn and bean, or we actually might shift and begin to produce food for the rest of the country. And that can change.
Jeff, it's great talking to you. I always like talking to you. I hope that you recruit a bunch of people from Sardinia to come live in Iowa, stop in Chicago along the way, and I'll talk to you real soon. I'll look forward to seeing you.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Thanks for coming on. And everyone stay tuned. We'll be right back with a little bit of closeout, a little bit of music information here at Live from the Heartland for the week of June 10th. Be right back. We're going to close out now. I want to thank our earlier guests, both Jeff Biggers and Michael Harrington. And now I'm going to bring on our music producer who brings us so much great talent over the years, the one and only Lynn Orman. Hello, Lynn.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me back.
Hey, without you, we would be nowhere. And I want to thank you once again. When we went to see Mo Better Brown, that was great. I'm glad we had him on the show. We only have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and I wanted you to give people a kind of a roundup of what happens on Friday night on this weekend. This show goes up on YouTube on Thursday night or sometime by Thursday. It airs on Saturday and Wednesday on LUW. It's on YouTube. So what do you got in the future, like in the next couple of days on?
Well, in the future, I want to say that we are going to get Charlie Musselwhite on right before his performance at Ravinia. He's going to be on the Carousel stage the first, I think it's August 3rd. So stay tuned for that, everybody.
I haven't talked to Charlie Musselwhite since Jazz Record Mart in 1962.
Well, he came to Chicago, became a part of that whole teenage scene with the blues kids, with Elvin Bishop and Barry Goldberg and Mike Bloomfield and Paul Butterfield. And he is in the movie, which will premiere official screening this Friday, called Born in Chicago. But if you catch this early on Friday on YouTube, Friday night, there is a Chicago Blues Super Session at Reggie's, which is going to be extraordinary. Throughout the whole weekend, Reggie's Rock Club, which is on South Michigan Avenue, is really a great place to hang out. Sunday night, I hear that Los Lobos may be joining the Jam after party after Blues Fest. They are headlining, of course, on Sunday. And on Saturday, there's a great, great tribute to the women in blues, Dietra Farr, Sugar Pie DeSanto, who was a chess recording artist, and Catherine Davis on the main stage at the Pritzker Pavilion. And also, if you're a jazz fan, you can't miss the new release of our friend, Joni Pilato with Fareed Hawk. Will be at the Green Mill, right in Uptown. So, and if anybody's going to Navy Pier, there is a great new exhibit called The State of Sound, which came from the Lincoln Museum in Springfield. And it covers every genre from industrial to house to hip hop to Bob Marovich gospel to blues and jazz. And it's a great, great exhibit at Navy Pier.
Lynn, that was a great report. I want to thank you very much. We're running out of time. I want everyone to who's listening in or watching, however you may get it, and we do it a lot of ways now. Remember to do what Athletes United for Peace do. Do sports, not war. And when you're out there trying to make the world a better place, you run into some resistance. Remember, people can change. You got to develop your abilities. Thank you to all the people who make this show possible. Women in the Blues, like Lynn Orman, Katie Hogan, and Tom Clark, Hal James, and Michael James here. See you next week. I'll be in El Paso with basketball in the barrio. I'll be reporting a little bit of information from there. Sorry, I'm going to miss Los Lobos. Haven't seen them since there was a knife fight on the floor of the Quiet Night back in the old days.
Wow.
Over and out. Do good in the world, buddies and sisters, everybody. Brothers, sisters, they, them, to everybody. Do good in the world. The world needs all the good that all of us do.